Tom, a 12-year-old boy, was heartbroken when his dog Max died suddenly. His father, Mark, buried Max in their backyard, with Tom placing Max's favorite toy beside him. 2 nights later, Tom couldn't shake the feeling of hearing familiar barking outside his window. Desperate and confused, he decided to investigate. The barking grew louder, filling Tom with a mix of hope and fear. Mark and Tom stood in the backyard, shovel in hand. The evening sun cast long shadows as they carefully lowered Max into the ground. Heartbroken, Tom placed Max's favorite toy beside him. Mark patted Tom's shoulder, a silent show of comfort, then started to cover Max with soil. A single tear rolled down Tom's cheek as he muttered, "Goodbye, Max." They stood in silence, marking the spot with a small rock. 2 nights later, Tom lay in bed staring at the ceiling. A soft breeze pushed through his window when he suddenly heard faint barking. Tom sat up, straining his ears to catch the sound. "Max!" he whispered, his heart pounding. The barking continued, familiar and distinct. Confusion turned to determination as he decided to find the source. He grabbed his flashlight from the nightstand, taking a deep breath before heading out. Heart racing, Tom crept downstairs and slipped out the back door. The cool night air filled his lungs as the barking grew clearer. He pointed his flashlight towards the yard, scanning the ground and bushes. "Max, is that you?" he called, his voice trembling. The barking seemed to be coming from the direction of Max's grave. With hesitant steps, he crossed the lawn, eyes darting left and right. Nothing moved in the darkness. The barking grew louder as Tom approached the spot where Max was buried. His flashlight beam wavered, casting eerie shadows across the yard. "It sounds just like him," Tom murmured, both hope and fear battling within him. He moved the light across the gravestone, his breath hitching as the barking seemed to echo from beneath the earth. Despite the fear creeping up his spine, he found himself rooted in place, unable to move. Shivering from the cool breeze and the eerie night, Tom scanned the yard one last time. The barks faded into the whispering wind. Still unsure of what he'd heard, Tom slowly retreated to the house, his flashlight shaking slightly. He stepped inside, locking the back door behind him. Unsure and troubled, he trudged upstairs and climbed back into bed. The barking haunted his thoughts, making sleep a distant dream. Over dinner, Tom couldn't hold it in any longer. "Mom, Dad, I heard Max barking last night," he blurted out, pushing his peas around his plate. His mother paused, looking at Mark. "Tom, honey, you're still grieving," she said gently. Mark nodded, adding, "Sometimes our minds play tricks on us when we miss someone." Tom shook his head, stubbornly insisting, "But it was so real, Dad. I know what I heard." Mark leaned back in his chair, sighing softly. He knew Tom was hurting. "Tom, I understand you miss Max a lot," he started, choosing his words carefully. "But you have to remember, dogs don't come back from the dead." Tom looked down at his plate, feeling a mix of sadness and frustration. I just really thought it was him," he muttered. Mark placed a comforting hand on Tom's shoulder. That night, Tom was drawn to the backyard again. The barking, faint at first, grew louder with each passing minute. Unable to resist, he climbed out of bed and grabbed his flashlight. "I've got to know," he whispered, tiptoeing downstairs. The back door creaked as he opened it slightly, stepping into the night. The yard was still, but the barking seemed to call to him, pulling him towards Max's resting place. Flashlight in hand, Tom rushed outside, his heart racing. The barking grew louder, echoing through the still night air. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the yard, searching desperately for any sign of Max. But the backyard remained unchanged. No movement, no shadows, just the familiar stillness. "Where are you?" he whispered, feeling a mix of disappointment and determination. Despite the empty yard, the feeling of Max's presence lingered. Sarah watched Tom push his cereal around the bowl. He hadn't spoken much since Max died. "Honey, are you okay?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Tom shrugged, not meeting her eyes. She exchanged a glance with Mark. "He's still so sad," she whispered later when Tom went upstairs. Mark nodded. "He'll come around," he said, though his voice wasn't entirely confident. Tom climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to his chin. The night's events replayed in his mind. He heard the barking, clear and familiar. Turning onto his side, Tom squeezed his eyes shut, trying to will himself to sleep, but his thoughts kept circling back. "Why am I hearing Max if he's gone?" he thought. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and he drifted into a fitful sleep. The next morning, Tom stepped out onto the porch and his heart skipped a beat. Lying there was Max's favorite chew toy, a worn-out plush toy. He picked it up cautiously, turning it over in his hands. Memories of Max joyfully playing with it flooded back. "How did this get here?" he muttered, looking around. No one else was in sight. The mystery deepened, and Tom's curiosity was piqued. Tom rushed inside, holding the toy. "Dad, look!" Mark glanced up from his coffee. "What's that, buddy?" Tom held up the chew toy. Max's favorite toy. It was on the porch. How did it get there? Mark furrowed his brow. "Maybe you forgot where you left it," he suggested, sipping his coffee. Tom shook his head furiously. "No, I'm sure I put it with Max." Mark's calm demeanor didn't waver. Sarah noticed Tom still clutching the toy and stepped in. "Tom, why don't you go play with your friends today?" she suggested, her voice gentle. "It might take your mind off things." Tom hesitated, but nodded slowly. "I guess so," he mumbled. Sarah ruffled his hair. "Good boy. You need some fresh air." She hoped spending time with friends would lift his spirits, even if just a little. Despite Sarah's suggestion, Tom couldn't shake the unsettled feeling. He tried to play video games, but kept glancing at the porch. The chew toy's sudden appearance gnawed at him. "Something's not right," he whispered, pacing his room. His friends called, but he wasn't in the mood to chat. All he could think about was Max and the strange, lingering barking. Curiosity and fear kept his mind spinning. Try as he might, Tom couldn't stop thinking about Max's toy and the eerie barking. "It has to mean something," he murmured. He sat on his bed, turning the toy over in his hands. Every squeak felt like Max calling to him. "Am I going crazy?" he wondered. He heard his mom calling for dinner but felt detached. The mysteries consumed him, demanding answers he couldn't ignore. As Tom lay in bed that night, a chilling thought struck him. What if something more sinister is going on? He wondered aloud. He remembered stories of hauntings and ghost pets. His skin prickled with fear. "I need to know the truth," he whispered to himself. Max wasn't just a dog, he was family. And if there was something amiss, Tom felt compelled to uncover it. Determined to get to the bottom of his suspicions, Tom decided to investigate the backyard. He grabbed his flashlight, the beam cutting through the early morning mist. "Where could it be?" he mumbled, pushing through the tall grass. He knelt by Max's grave, running his hand over the disturbingly fresh soil. "Something isn't right here," he said, feeling more confused. The grave looked undisturbed, but his gut told him otherwise. Tom's next step was to talk to the neighbors. Mrs. Langford, next door, was always in her garden. "Hi, Mrs. Langford," he greeted as he approached. She smiled warmly. "Hello, Tom. How are you holding up?" He nodded. "I've been hearing barking at night. Have you noticed anything?" She tilted her head thoughtfully. "No, dear. I haven't heard anything unusual." Disappointed, Tom thanked her and decided to try the next house. Meanwhile, strange things started adding up around the yard. Tom noticed little disturbances here and there. The garbage can toppled over without explanation. The gate creaked open in the middle of the night, even though Tom was sure he had latched it. His father Mark brushed it off as animals or the wind. But Tom couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling growing inside him with each unexplained incident. One afternoon, Tom spotted paw prints near the back porch. They seemed fresh, leading from the gate towards Max's grave. He knelt down to get a closer look. The soil around the prints was still damp, likely from the dew that morning. Tom's eyes traced the line of the prints, which ended at a patch of disturbed soil near the grave. Something or someone had been digging. Determined to find out what was going on, Tom felt more convinced something wasn't right. He couldn't shake the feeling that Max's death wasn't the end of the story. The paw prints, the disturbed soil, and the nightly barking were more than just coincidences. "It has to be connected," Tom murmured, kicking a small pebble as he walked back to the house, his mind racing with questions. Tom tried talking to his friends about his suspicions during recess. "You guys ever hear of anything strange after a pet dies?" he asked. His best friend Jake laughed. "Tom, it's all in your head. You're just missing Max." Lucy nodded in agreement. "Yeah, you're just grieving. Things will get better." But Tom shook his head. "You don't understand. Something's off." His friends shrugged, dismissing his concerns entirely. Unable to let it go, Tom decided to take matters into his own hands. He grabbed his flashlight and waited until everyone was asleep. The house was silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. Stealthily, he slipped out of bed and tiptoed downstairs. With every creak of the floorboard, his resolution strengthened. He had to know. Taking a deep breath, he opened the back door and stepped outside. Tom decided the best way to find out the truth was to lie in wait. He positioned himself by the window, flashlight clutched tightly in his hand. He kept peeking out, watching the yard. The night was calm. The only sound was the distant rustle of leaves. His heart pounded with anticipation. Every few minutes, he'd glance at the clock, waiting for the familiar barking to begin again. As midnight approached, the silence was shattered by the familiar barking. Tom's eyes widened. He threw on his jacket and bolted outside, the flashlight beam bouncing as he ran. The barking continued, louder and more urgent. "Max!" Tom shouted, scanning the area. The noise seemed to be coming from the woods behind the yard's edge. Taking a deep breath, he stepped beyond the yard, the darkness swallowing him whole. Tom's heart pounded as he crept through the yard, focusing the flashlight on the source of the barking. His breath caught as a quick-moving shadow darted behind a tree. "Who's there?" he called out, inching closer. But before he could get a better look, the shadow disappeared into the darkness. Tom strained his eyes, trying to catch any movement, but the night remained still and quiet again. Confused and a bit scared, Tom swung the flashlight around and noticed fresh paw prints leading towards the edge of the yard. The prints were large and clear. He followed them until they vanished into the woods. Fear crept up his spine, and he decided it was best to head back. Maybe talking it over with his parents again in the morning would shed some light on the situation. In the morning, Tom approached his parents during breakfast. "Mom, Dad, I saw something last night. There were fresh paw prints and a shadow." They exchanged concerned looks. "Tom, we've been through this. Max is gone," Mark said gently. Sarah sighed, adding, "Honey, maybe you need more rest." Frustrated, Tom crumpled his napkin. "You don't believe me," he muttered, storming out of the room. Clearly, he was on his own. Driven by curiosity and a growing sense of urgency, Tom decided to stay up every night. He camped out near his window, flashlight in hand, ready to catch any unusual activity. The moon cast long shadows across the yard as Tom remained vigilant, his eyes fixed on Max's grave. The silence of the night only heightened his anticipation, but he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how long it took. On the third night, just as his eyelids grew heavy, Tom heard a faint barking. The sound was unmistakably familiar. Like a shot, he grabbed his flashlight and tiptoed outside. The night air was cool against his face, and the distant barking grew slightly louder. "Max!" he whispered, clutching the flashlight tighter. Step by step, he moved closer to the source of the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. This time, Tom followed the barking with a new sense of determination. The yard under the moonlight appeared almost otherworldly. He moved cautiously, careful not to make any noise. The barking led him closer and closer until he found himself standing near Max's grave. The soil looked like it had been disturbed. Tom's breath hitched as he slowly lowered the flashlight to get a better view of the ground. Tom noticed the grave looked slightly disturbed, as if someone or something had tampered with it. He knelt down, running his fingers over the loose earth. It was clear that the soil had been moved recently. Who could have done this? He wondered aloud. The disturbed grave added another layer to the mystery. Every nerve in his body was telling him that something strange was happening right in his own backyard. As Tom knelt by the disturbed grave, his heart raced with a confusing mix of fear and excitement. His breath quickened with each glance at the ground. "Am I getting closer to the truth?" he thought, swallowing hard. Every fiber of his being was tense, ready for whatever might happen next. The night was still, but Tom felt alive with possibilities as he scanned the yard for more clues. With his heart thumping and mind racing, Tom realized he must be getting closer to the truth. He looked around, half expecting to see a shadow or hear another bark. Could Max really be out there? He questioned himself. The disturbed soil and faint barking couldn't be mere coincidences. Determined more than ever, Tom vowed to keep investigating until he uncovered what was really happening. Tom knew he had to keep track of everything he was discovering. He found an old journal under his bed and started documenting his findings. Each entry detailed the odd occurrences, from the barking to the disturbed grave. "Maybe writing it down will help me see something I'm missing," he muttered, scribbling quickly. The journal became his new companion in this strange quest for the truth about Max. Tom brainstormed additional ways to capture evidence. He climbed into the attic and found an old camera covered in dust. "This should do it," he grinned, blowing off the dirt. That night, he set up the camera on a tripod pointed directly at Max's grave. "Let's see what you can catch," he whispered to the camera. With renewed determination, he hoped to record any nocturnal activities that might provide answers. Each night, Tom continued his vigilant watch by the window, making sure the camera was recording. He listened carefully, waiting for the faint barking to start again. He jotted down every sound, every movement he noticed. Each note made his journal thicker. "I'll catch something soon," he reassured himself. The feeling of Max's presence lingered in the air, motivating Tom to keep pushing and to not give up. One night, Tom finally captured something on the old camera. The footage was blurry, but it showed a dog-like figure near the grave. His heart skipped a beat as he played back the recording, frame by frame. "It looks like Max," he muttered, squinting at the screen. The figure was hard to distinguish, but its shape was undeniably similar. Tom's excitement surged as he realized he was onto something big. Having seen the blurry footage, Tom's resolve to uncover the truth about Max only grew stronger. He reviewed the tapes several times, analyzing every frame. "This can't be a coincidence," he muttered. Each replay of the footage bolstered his belief that something unusual was happening. Determined to get clearer evidence, he repositioned the camera and adjusted the settings, hoping the next recording would give him undeniable proof. Buoyed by the blurry footage, Tom felt a renewed sense of purpose. "Finally, they'll believe me," he whispered. He spent the entire day eagerly anticipating the moment he could show the evidence to his parents. That night, he waited for them to finish dinner. With the camera in hand, Tom approached them, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Mom, Dad, I've got something to show you," he announced proudly. Tom marched into the living room where his parents were sitting. This time, he felt empowered, armed with his journal and the camera footage. "Dad, you have to see this," he said firmly, holding up the camera. Mark and Sarah looked up, curiosity piqued. "I've been keeping track of everything," Tom explained, flipping open his journal. He pressed play on the footage, eager to see their reactions. "Look, it's blurry, but it's Max." Mark watched the footage, his brow furrowing in concern. "Tom, I see the figure, but it might be another dog from the neighborhood," he said. Tom's heart sank. "But Dad, it looks just like Max," he insisted. Mark sighed and tried to keep his voice level. "Tom, I need you to understand that sometimes our minds see what we want to see. There are many dogs around here," he explained. Frustrated by his father's dismissal, Tom decided to take matters into his own hands once more. When his parents were out for the day, he grabbed a small shovel and headed to Max's grave. "I have to find out for myself," he thought. He began to dig, the sun casting a warm glow over the yard. Soon, he unearthed small bones and something shiny, causing his heart to race. As he sifted through the loose soil, Tom uncovered old dog tags. They were rusty and worn, with faint engravings still visible. "These don't belong to Max," he murmured, turning them over in his hands. The discovery of the bones and dog tags deepened the mystery. Max isn't the first dog buried here, he realized. This new evidence left him more perplexed and driven than ever before. Tom's thoughts raced as he considered the evidence before him. The old dog tags and bones hinted at a deeper story. Could there be another dog involved? He wondered. The familiar barking, the disturbed grave, everything pointed to something more than just Max's death. He recalled hearing about missing dogs in the neighborhood. Maybe Max's disappearance is connected to them, he thought, his curiosity growing stronger. The newfound evidence fueled Tom's drive to uncover the truth. "I can't stop now," he told himself. Each discovery pushed him closer to understanding what happened to Max. He spent hours researching in the library, looking for anything that could link the old dog tags to a missing pet. The puzzle pieces were slowly coming together, but there were still many questions left unanswered. Tom was more determined than ever. One afternoon, Tom overheard his dad talking to a neighbor, Mrs. Langford, about a lost dog. "It matches Max's description," Mark said. Tom's ears perked up. He crept closer to the door, straining to hear. "Yes, a mixed breed with tan and black fur," his dad continued. Mrs. Langford sighed. "I've heard about another dog like that wandering the area," she said. Tom's mind raced, connecting the dots. Tom hid behind the door, listening intently. Mrs. Langford and his dad talked about dogs that matched Max's description. "There's another dog in the neighborhood that looks just like Max," she said. Tom's heart skipped a beat. Could this be the same dog he had been hearing? The conversation confirmed his suspicions. There was more to the story. Tom knew he needed to find this other dog to uncover the truth. Tom's mind raced with the possibility that Max might still be alive. The conversation he overheard filled him with hope. Maybe there's a chance, he thought, his heart pounding with excitement. He started connecting the dots between the familiar barking and the other dog in the neighborhood. "I need to find more clues," he decided, feeling a renewed sense of determination to get to the bottom of the mystery. With this new glimmer of hope, Tom decided the best way to find more clues was to follow his dad. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined. "I have to do this," he whispered to himself. The next day, he waited for his dad to leave the house. Keeping a safe distance, he tailed his dad through the neighborhood, hoping to uncover more information about Max. Tom watched as Mark went to a house he didn't recognize. An old friend, perhaps? He crouched behind a bush, straining to see and hear. Mark knocked on the door, and an older man answered with a warm smile. Tom's heart raced. What are they talking about? He wondered. Staying out of sight, Tom moved closer, hoping to catch pieces of their conversation and find more clues about Max. Tom pressed himself against the side of the house, ears straining. He could hear Mark and his friend talking inside. "The night Max was buried," Mark began. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to hear more clearly. They discussed the events of that night, each word revealing a bit more about what happened. There's more to this story, Tom realized, hanging on their every word. Piecing together the bits of conversation he overheard, Tom realized that Max's appearance that night had been deceiving. It wasn't what it seemed, Mark's friend had said. Tom's mind raced with possibilities. What really happened to Max? He wondered. The idea that Max's death wasn't straightforward filled Tom with a mix of hope and confusion. He knew he needed to dig deeper to understand what was going on. Tom's heart pounded as he continued to listen. There was another dog involved that looked similar to Max, Mark's friend mentioned. The realization hit Tom like a bolt of lightning. That explains the barking, he thought. The pieces were falling into place. There had to be more to the story. Tom felt both relieved and anxious, knowing that his quest for the truth was far from over. Tom overheard a new piece of information. A local shelter had recently closed. Mark's friend mentioned it in passing, but Tom latched onto it. Could there be a connection? He wondered. The idea of Max being mixed up with dogs from the shelter made sense. Tom felt a new sense of urgency. I need to check out that shelter, he decided, knowing it could be a significant clue. While trying to inch closer, Tom's foot kicked a toolbox and it clattered loudly. Panic surged through him as the tools scattered. No, 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 he muttered, frantically trying to gather them up. From inside, voices hushed, and he knew he'd been heard. He had to act fast. Abandoning the tools, Tom bolted away from the house, heart racing, fearing he'd blown his cover. He needed to get home. Noticed by Mark and his friend, Tom sprinted back home, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His heart pounded not just from running, but from the rush of adrenaline. That was too close, he thought. Bursting through the back door, he raced upstairs to his room. He needed to collect his thoughts and plan his next move. Confronting his dad felt like the next logical step, despite the risk. Tom gathered all the evidence he'd collected, the journal, the blurry footage, and the dog tags. His hands trembled, but determination steeled his nerves. Dad needs to know everything, he thought, taking a deep breath. He laid everything out on his bed, running through what he'd say. This confrontation was crucial. He walked downstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. It was time to get some answers. Tom stood in the living room, evidence laid out on the table before him. Dad, we need to talk, he said firmly. Mark looked up, concern etched on his face. What's this about, Tom? Tom took a deep breath. I found things. Max's grave was disturbed, and there's another dog's tags in our yard. I need to know the truth, he demanded, his voice unwavering. Mark's face paled as he looked from Tom to the evidence. All right, son, you deserve the truth, he said, the tension in the room palpable. He sat down, his hands trembling slightly. I didn't want to burden you with this, but it's time you knew. Tom's eyes widened, anticipation coursing through him. Mark took a deep breath, readying himself to spill the secrets he had been keeping. The wrong dog buried. Mark's voice was somber as he began. That night, I made a mistake. Max wasn't the dog I buried. Tom's confusion deepened. What do you mean? He asked. Mark sighed, looking into Tom's eyes. Another dog had died near our yard, a stray. I didn't realize until later that I had buried the wrong dog, he admitted, the weight of his mistake clearly showing on his face. Max was only injured. Tom's mind raced as Mark continued. The barking you've been hearing, it's Max. He wasn't dead, just injured, Mark said. Tom's eyes widened in disbelief. But I heard him barking after we buried him, he exclaimed. Yes, Mark nodded. Max had managed to crawl away and was just hurt. I couldn't bear to tell you until I knew for sure it was him. Mark explained further. After realizing my mistake, I found Max. He was hurt, so I took him to the vet immediately. They treated him, and I kept hoping he'd come back to you. Tom was stunned. So Max is alive? He asked, tears welling up in his eyes. Yes, and he managed to return home on his own, Mark said, relief evident in his voice. Mark continued, "Max has been looking for his family, for you, Tom. The dog we buried was a stray that wandered into our yard." Tom's heart ached at the thought of Max trying to find them while they thought he was gone. "He must have been scared and hurt," Tom whispered. Mark nodded. "Yes, but he's back now, and we need to find him." Heartbroken and relieved, Tom followed Mark outside. As they called out, a familiar figure emerged from the bushes. "Max!" Tom cried, rushing over. Max, with a slight limp but otherwise okay, wagged his tail enthusiastically. Mark watched as Tom hugged Max tightly, tears streaming down his face. "I missed you so much, buddy," Tom whispered into Max's fur. The reunion was everything he had hoped for. Mark's apology. Mark approached Tom as he kneeled beside Max. "Tom, I'm so sorry for not telling you sooner," Mark said, guilt evident in his eyes. Tom nodded slowly, understanding lighting his face. "I forgive you, Dad, but please be honest with me from now on," he replied. Mark promised, "I will, son. No more secrets." They shared a moment of understanding, the tension between them easing. Closure for the family. The family gathered around Max, their hearts lighter as the truth came to light. Tom felt a sense of closure, finally understanding what had happened. "We're so glad you're home, Max," Sarah said, petting the dog gently. The bond between them strengthened, and they vowed to cherish every moment together. Tom looked at his parents, grateful to have Max back and for the honesty they now shared. Life slowly returned to normal with Max back in the family. Tom spent his days playing with Max, never taking their time together for granted. Each bark, tail wag, and playful romp in the yard reminded him of the love and loyalty between them. The mystery had been solved, and peace settled over the household once more. Tom felt immense gratitude, knowing the importance of honesty and family.